Welcome back, everyone. Last week we focused on converting physical materials into digital form. We talked about file formats, compression, content types, and the mechanics of how images, text, audio, and video get captured and stored. That was all about taking something analog and making it digital. This week we are making a conceptual shift. We are asking a different question. What do you do with materials that were never physical to begin with? No original photograph to scan, no document to run through a feeder, just code, just data. And yet these materials, software, databases, websites, email, may be some of the most historically significant records your institution will ever be asked to preserve. That is what the first half of this lecture is about. The second half takes us into the physical layer, the actual devices that hold digital data. We are going to walk through 5 types of storage media in a way that gives you a practitioner's understanding of each, how it works, what it is good for, and where it will fail you. Chapters 6 through 10 of Leggett are your reading for this lecture, and I would encourage you to read alongside the slides rather than before or after. The chapters are approachable and detailed, and the technical explanations in the text will reinforce what you hear here. Let's get into it. For the past 2 weeks, the implicit model has been there is a physical thing, and we are making a copy of it in digital form. The physical thing still exists. If our digital copy fails, we still have the original. Born digital content breaks that model completely. There is no physical original. There is no analog version sitting in an acid-free folder somewhere. If the digital object is lost, it is simply gone. And that raises the stakes of preservation considerably. Leggett defines born digital materials as content that is originally digital in nature and may be impossible to store and use in any other way. The examples she walks through, software, databases, websites, and email, are a useful starting set. They are not exhaustive, but they represent the categories you are most likely to encounter professionally, and each one has a distinct preservation challenge. The thread that connects all of them is this. To preserve a born digital object, you often have to preserve the environment in which it runs, not just the object itself. That is a fundamentally different problem from preservation of physical materials, and it is one the profession is still actively working through. Let's start with software. A software program is, at its most basic, a set of instructions a computer follows. But here is the thing. Those instructions only mean something in a very specific context. They require a particular operating system. They may require a particular version of that operating system. They may require other programs to run, and they require hardware that can execute them. This is what Leggett calls the dependency problem, and it is why archiving software is so much more complex than archiving a document. To run archived software, you typically need 4 things. First, the source code, the original human-readable version of the program, written in a programming language that a person who knows that language can understand. Second, a compiler, the tool that translates source code into machine language, which is what the computer actually reads. Third, a compatible operating system. And fourth, the platform, any additional programs the software requires to execute. Here is the practical implication. If you archive a software program but not its operating system, or if the operating system it requires no longer exists and no emulator is available, then you have archived something you cannot run. The bits are there, the meaning is not accessible. Leggett gives a real case that makes this concrete. In 2004, the FDA needed to access records about recipients of an improperly processed batch of botulin. The records were in a file created with the 2003 version of a particular business software. The 2004 version of that software could not open the file. The manufacturer could not provide a copy of the older version. The file was eventually opened using an archived copy of the old software held by the National Software Reference Library. That is a preservation success story. But it was also a near miss that should give anyone in this profession pause. When we talk about archiving software, the distinction between source code and compiled code matters a great deal. Source code is written in a programming language, something like Python, Perl, Java. It is human readable. If you have source code and someone who understands the language, you can determine what the program does. You can potentially migrate it to a newer language. You have options. Compiled code is what source code becomes after it is translated into machine language. It is what a computer executes. Most commercial software is distributed only in compiled form, and the license terms typically prohibit attempting to reverse engineer it back into source code. Open source software is the exception. The whole premise of open source is that the source code is publicly available. From a preservation standpoint, open source software is much easier to work with because you have the raw material. You are not locked out. The Library of Congress recommends noting the compiler used in a software program's metadata, and in cases where the compiler itself is unique or rare, archiving the compiler alongside the software. This is the kind of detail that sounds excessive until the day you actually need it. Every piece of modern software requires an operating system to run. The operating system coordinates the program's instructions with the actual hardware of the computer. Archive the software without its OS, and you may have an object you cannot use. This gets complicated quickly when you consider how many operating systems have come and gone. We think of operating systems today as a fairly small set: Windows, macOS, Linux, Android, iOS. But computing history is full of operating systems that were once widely used and are now completely gone. If your archive holds software designed for one of those systems, you have a problem. Emulation is the main solution the field has developed. An emulator is software that makes one computer behave like a different computer. The program DOSBox, for example, allows a modern machine to run programs designed for MS-DOS, a Microsoft operating system that has not been commercially available since the early 1990s. The Internet Archive actually maintains a malware collection using emulation. It allows users to experience malware programs from the 1980s and 90s without actually executing the harmful portions. Emulation is not a perfect solution. Emulators have to be maintained. They introduce their own layer of dependency. But for many categories of software, it is the most viable preservation strategy currently available. Let's talk about databases, which Leggett describes well as a kind of invisible infrastructure. You interact with databases constantly without thinking about them. When you sign into an online account, your credentials are checked against a database. When you make a purchase, the transaction is recorded in a database. When you use your institution's catalog, you are querying a database. A database is a structured collection of related datasets that can be searched and sorted by a database management system, or DBMS. The examples Leggett uses are deliberately simple: temperature readings organized by date and location, but the principle scales to any structured data. Common formats for storing database data include CSV files, which use commas to separate values, and XML, which uses tags to both separate information and describe what it is. Both are plain text formats, which is good for long-term access. The challenge is that the data itself often only makes sense alongside the software designed to interpret it. Here is why this matters for archivists. You cannot fully preserve an interactive digital object without also preserving its database. A website that allows users to make purchases, leave comments, or update information is not just HTML and CSS. It is HTML and CSS plus a database. An archived version of that site without the database is like a library catalog without the records. The structure is there, but the content is not. Websites present some of the most complicated preservation challenges in the born digital landscape. Let me walk you through why. A simple, static website is just HTML and CSS, plain text files with markup that tells a browser how to display them. That is not too hard to archive. But most websites are not static. Most websites involve image files, video files, custom fonts, scripting files written in JavaScript or PHP, and one or more databases. Archiving a complete website means capturing all of those components and making sure they still work together in an archived environment. There is also the rendering problem. HTML and CSS are living standards. They change over time. A website built in 2005 using HTML techniques that were standard then may not display correctly in a modern browser, because some of those techniques are now deprecated. The reverse is also true. A website built with modern CSS features may not render correctly in an older browser. Preserving the site sometimes means preserving a specific version of a specific browser, which then introduces all the same operating system and hardware dependencies we discussed with software. Web crawlers, automated programs that move through websites collecting data, are the main tool for website archiving. The Internet Archive's Wayback Machine uses this approach. But even the most sophisticated web crawlers have limits. They can capture what is on the page. They typically cannot capture the database behind it. And for a website that changes daily, decisions about capture frequency are themselves curatorial decisions with significant implications. Leggett makes a point that I think is worth sitting with. Websites and social media are how contemporary history is being made. Future archivists and historians will look back at this period and rely on archived web content the way we now rely on newspapers and correspondence. The decisions being made now about what to archive and how will shape what future researchers can access. Email is, in essence, a text file, but the variety of file formats used to store email and the tight coupling between those formats and specific client software creates real preservation challenges. The EML format, used by Microsoft Outlook Express and a number of other clients, is one of the most interoperable. One useful feature Leggett points out: if you change the file extension from .eml to .txt or .html, you can open and read the email in any plain text editor. That is a meaningful preservation affordance. It means the content is not locked inside a proprietary application. The MBOX format is also widely used. MBOX actually refers to a family of related formats: MBOXO, MBOXRD, MBOXCL, and MBOXCL2. They store entire folders of email rather than individual messages, with messages separated by a single line. The catch is that these four variants are not compatible with one another. Software that works with one may not work with another, which is exactly the kind of technical fragmentation that makes preservation planning complicated. The broader challenge with email is access. Locally installed email clients, Outlook, Thunderbird, Apple Mail, store files on the user's machine, which makes them relatively accessible for export and archiving. Web-based clients, Gmail, Yahoo, university webmail systems, often do not allow file-level access to the underlying messages. You can read your email through the interface, but you may not be able to export the raw files in a format suitable for archiving. This is an active policy and technical problem in the archival community, particularly for institutional email. The correspondence of university administrators, department chairs, government officials, all increasingly conducted through web-based systems that were not designed with archiving in mind. Before we move to storage media, I want to land one central idea from this first half. With born digital materials, content and context are inseparable. You cannot preserve the content without also preserving, or at minimum documenting, the environment in which that content was created and used. For software, that means the OS and the compiler. For databases, it means the schema and the software that interprets the data. For websites, it means the rendering environment. For email, it means the client and the format. This is why born digital preservation is not just a technical problem. It is an institutional problem. It requires policies, planning, and ongoing investment. And it is one of the reasons that the field has moved toward emulation and format migration as long-term strategies, rather than trying to maintain the original hardware and software environments indefinitely. With that framing in place, let's shift to the physical layer. We are going to spend the second half of this lecture on storage media, the devices that actually hold digital data. One thing I want to establish before we get into specific media: there is no perfect storage medium. Every option we are about to discuss has strengths, vulnerabilities, and a failure mode. The professional standard is not to find the best single medium and use it exclusively. It is to use multiple media in multiple locations to protect against the specific failure modes of each. We covered file formats in detail last week. This week we are looking at the physical objects that hold those files. 5 types: floppy disks, optical media, magnetic tape, hard disk drives, and flash memory. We will go through them in roughly chronological order of their emergence. which also happens to map onto a progression from legacy formats you will encounter in existing collections to current formats you will actively choose for new storage. I can see some of you thinking, floppy disks? Really? And yes, really. At the peak of their popularity, approximately 5 billion floppy disks were sold per year. The 3.5-inch version held 1.44 megabytes of data, which is enough to store a couple of small photographs. By today's standards, that is almost nothing. But decades of human activity were documented on these disks, and unique, unreplicated data may be sitting on floppies in collections you will work with. Leggett gives two cases that make the point vividly. Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, left behind around 200 floppy disks when he died in 1991. Most of the data was recoverable, though it required significant effort because the disks had been written using an obsolete operating system. Princeton University acquired Toni Morrison's papers in 2014, which included about 150 floppy disks. From those disks, archivists recovered early drafts of beloved correspondence and royalty information. This was particularly significant because many of Morrison's paper documents had been destroyed in a fire. The floppy disks were the only surviving version of that material. So, how do these things work? The inside of a floppy disk is a round piece of plastic coated with iron oxide, a magnetic material. Binary ones and zeros are encoded as tiny magnetized areas, oriented either north to south or south to north. Data is organized in circular tracks, which are read by a tiny electromagnet. The disk spins on a spindle to position the electromagnet at the right track. The 3.5-inch version added a spring-loaded metal shutter that closes automatically when the disk is not in use, which was a significant improvement over the paper envelopes used with earlier sizes. For retrieval, external USB floppy drives are available for 3.5-inch disks, though 5.25-inch and 8-inch readers are considerably harder to find. Different density formats also require different readers. A double-density reader will not necessarily work with a high-density disk, or vice versa. For recovery, disk imaging is preferable to simple file copying. A disk image captures not just the files, but deleted file information, unused space, metadata, and modification dates. It gives you a complete picture of what was on the disk when it was imaged, which has value for both preservation and forensic research. For physical preservation, floppy disks are vulnerable to magnetic fields. Even a refrigerator magnet can damage data. They are sensitive to heat and sunlight. The 8 and 5.25-inch versions are particularly fragile. Do not bend them, do not stack them, do not label them with ballpoint pens. Felt tip markers only. Optical media, CDs, DVDs, and Blu-ray discs store data using a laser. The core mechanism is elegantly simple. The data layer inside the disc has microscopic features that either reflect a lot of light back to a sensor, which reads as a 1, or reflect less light, which reads as a 0. All three formats share the same basic layered construction. You have a polycarbonate base, a metallic data layer, and a lacquer coating on top. The differences among CD, DVD, and Blu-ray come down to how densely information is packed onto the data layer, which depends on the precision of the laser used to read it. The CD uses a red laser with a wavelength of 780 nanometers and stores up to about 700 megabytes. The DVD uses a red laser with a slightly shorter wavelength of 650 nanometers, which allows for smaller pits and more data, up to 17 gigabytes, depending on configuration. Blu-ray uses a blue laser with a wavelength of 405 nanometers. That finer wavelength allows for pits as small as 0.32 microns, compared to 0.74 microns for DVD. The result is up to 128 gigabytes on a single disc. Within each format, there are three types. The ROM versions, CD-ROM, DVD-ROM, BD-ROM, have data physically pressed into them during manufacturing and cannot be altered. The R versions, CDR, DVD-R, BD-R, use a photosensitive dye layer that a laser burns to encode data. They can be written to once. The RW versions use a phase change metal layer that can be switched between crystalline and amorphous states repeatedly, allowing the disk to be written and erased up to about 1,000 times. For archivists, the dye stability question is significant for CDRs and their equivalents. Three dye types are commonly found in recordable optical media: phthalocyanine, cyanine, and azo. Of these, phthalocyanine is the most stable. If you are choosing recordable optical media for archival use, that is the specification you want. The Library of Congress conducted a study of optical media longevity and found approximately a 4% error rate after 15 years of storage under ideal conditions. An accelerated aging study predicted that about 70% of tested disks would last around 100 years, while about 4% would fail within 10 years. That is a fairly wide range, and it underscores that storage conditions matter enormously. The main threats are disk rot, corrosion of the metallic layer, die instability from heat and light exposure, and delamination, where the disk's layers separate. Storage conditions: 39 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 to 50% relative humidity, upright in jewel cases, never stacked. Cleaning: soft, lint-free cloth, wiping from the center outward, never in circles. Label only on the label side, with water-based felt tip markers. Ballpoint pens can distort the data layer through the thin lacquer. Magnetic tape has been used for data storage since 1951. That is not a typo, 1951. It is the oldest method of electronic data storage that is still in active use today, and it remains the most cost-effective option for large-scale archival storage by a significant margin. To put that in concrete terms, as of 2018, a single tape cartridge could hold 15 terabytes of data, and magnetic tape costs less than 1 cent per gigabyte of storage space. No other medium comes close on that metric. This is why major institutions, including Google, use magnetic tape for mass backup. In 2011, when a Google software update accidentally deleted saved emails for 40,000 Gmail accounts, Google used tape backups to restore the lost data. That is a real-world reminder that tape is not an archaic curiosity. It is the backbone of large-scale digital preservation. The basic mechanism: tape stores binary ones and zeros as tiny magnetized areas on a coating of iron oxide, chromium dioxide, or pure iron. These areas are oriented either north to south or south to north, representing the two values. A read-write head moves along the tape as it plays, sensing the orientation of those magnetic fields and converting them into electrical signals the computer interprets as binary code. The key structural limitation of magnetic tape is that it uses sequential access. To get to a specific piece of data on a tape, the read/write heads have to physically pass through everything that comes before it. This makes tape slow for retrieval, which is why it is well suited for backup and long-term storage, where you are not planning to access the data often, and poorly suited for situations requiring quick access. The tape itself has two layers: a pigment layer, where the magnetic material is suspended in a polymer binder, and a polyester base layer. Older tapes used a cellulose acetate base, which is prone to a degradation condition called vinegar syndrome. Moisture causes the tape to produce acetic acid, which makes it smell strongly of vinegar and eventually causes it to dissolve. If you ever open an archival collection and smell vinegar coming from a box of tapes, that is the diagnosis. Modern tapes use polyester, which is far more stable. Storage conditions for magnetic tape: approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 40% relative humidity, stored upright, not flat. Keep tape away from magnetic fields, which can corrupt the data, and away from airborne pollutants, including smoke and dust. A single particle of smoke from a cigarette is large enough to obscure data from a read/write head on a modern high-density tape. Under room temperature archival storage conditions, tape is estimated to last between 10 and 30 years, with proper conditions extending that range. The disadvantages of tape are real but manageable if you go in with clear expectations. Tape drives are expensive specialty equipment that does not come standard on most computers. Sequential access makes retrieval slow. The medium is unfamiliar to most staff and requires training. And format obsolescence is a genuine long-term concern. As tape formats evolve, older formats may eventually lose hardware support, requiring migration to newer cartridges before reading becomes impossible. Hard disk drives, HDDs, are what most of us think of as the default storage medium for computers. They have been a standard component in desktop and laptop computers since the 1956 IBM 305 RAMAC, and the basic operating principle has not changed fundamentally since then. An HDD contains 1 to 4 circular platters, disks made from aluminum, glass, or ceramic, coated with a magnetizable material. Data is encoded on these platters in the same basic way as on magnetic tape, tiny magnetic fields oriented to represent ones and zeros. The key difference is how data is accessed. Unlike tape, an HDD uses direct access. The platters spin continuously, typically at 5,400 to 7,200 revolutions per minute. And the read/write head is mounted on a movable arm that can seek any location on the disk surface without reading through preceding data. This makes HDDs dramatically faster for retrieval than magnetic tape. Data is organized on platters in concentric circles called tracks, which are divided into sectors. Each sector holds 512 bytes. A phenomenon called fragmentation occurs when a file's data is written across non-contiguous sectors rather than in one continuous block. Defragmentation software addresses this by reorganizing data so that file components are stored adjacently, improving access speed. HDDs are well suited for active working storage, for RAID arrays that provide redundancy through multiple drives, and for situations where you need to access data frequently and quickly. They are less well suited for long-term archival storage in their design intent. They are built for frequent read/write cycling, and they will actually degrade if left unused for extended periods. A hard drive that sits untouched for years will start losing data and generating errors. Plan for periodic refreshing. The failure profile of HDDs is worth understanding. Hard drives are mechanical devices with many moving parts: a motor, bearings, lubricants, the spinning platters, the read/write arm. Each is a potential failure point. Failures can be sudden and without warning. The read/write head floats on a microscopic cushion of air above the platter surface. If that cushion is disrupted while the drive is running, the head can make physical contact with the platter, grinding away the data in a phenomenon called a head crash. Dropping a hard drive, even from a short distance, can cause this. A phenomenon called bit rot is also a concern. The microscopic magnetic encoding on an HDD can be erased by temperature fluctuations, particularly on drives that are not regularly in use. Storage conditions: below 125 degrees Fahrenheit, low humidity, stored flat with platters horizontal. Do not stack drives on top of one another. Handle with care. No dropping, no shaking. Protect against static electricity. Always eject external drives properly before disconnecting them. Pulling a drive while the computer is still writing to it can corrupt data or damage the drive. Flash memory is the most recent storage technology we are covering, developed by Dr. Fujio Masuoka at Toshiba and publicly presented in 1986. It is now ubiquitous. Smartphones, tablets, cameras, SSDs, and laptops all run on flash memory. The fundamental innovation of flash memory is that it retains data without a continuous power source, unlike RAM, while having no moving parts, unlike hard drives. This combination is what makes it ideal for portable devices and gives it its most significant archival advantage: durability. The mechanics are transistor-based. Each memory cell contains a floating gate surrounded by insulators. Data is encoded by injecting electrons into the floating gate, which makes the cell read as a 0, or leaving it empty, which is the default state of 1. The insulators keep the electrons trapped in place, allowing the cell to retain its value indefinitely without power. A pulse of electricity erases the cell and returns it to 1. Flash memory comes in 3 main device types you will encounter professionally. Solid-state drives, SSDs, are the highest capacity option and serve as direct replacements for hard drives in computers. They can be internal or external, and for archival purposes, an external SSD is the most useful configuration since it can be physically stored independently of a computer. Flash drives, also called thumb drives, jump drives, or memory sticks, are small, portable, and connect via USB. They are excellent for file transfer and secondary backup, but have lower capacities than SSDs. SD cards are the smallest form factor, primarily used in cameras and similar devices. They are highly portable, but prone to loss given their size. The durability advantage is real and significant. No moving parts means no mechanical failure modes. You can drop a flash drive and the data is almost certainly fine. Leggett gives a memorable example. In 2008, a couple dropped a digital camera into the ocean from a cruise ship. A fisherman later retrieved it in a fishing net. The images on the SD card were still readable. That is flash memory's durability profile in action. It held up against saltwater immersion for an extended period. Flash memory also tolerates temperature and humidity ranges that would damage other media. Some devices are rated for operation at temperatures below freezing and above 150 degrees Fahrenheit. This makes it a strong choice for situations where controlled storage environments cannot be guaranteed. The disadvantages: flash memory cells have a finite number of write cycles before they burn out. Each time you write to and erase a cell, you degrade it slightly. The total number of write cycles before failure is expressed as the device's endurance rating. For archival use, where you are writing data once and then leaving it alone, This is not a significant concern because you are not cycling through writes repeatedly, but it is something to understand about the technology. Like hard drives, flash memory also requires periodic refreshing. Electrons can slowly leak from the cells over time, even without writes, effectively erasing the stored data. This is sometimes called data retention decay. For long-term archival storage, plan to migrate flash storage every few years, or at minimum verify data integrity on a regular schedule. Price is the other significant limitation. Flash memory remains the most expensive storage option per gigabyte, though prices have continued to fall and the gap between flash and hard drives has narrowed considerably. Let me take a moment to pull these 5 media types into a comparative frame, because in practice, the question you will face is not which medium to use, it is how to combine them. Floppy disks and optical media are legacy formats that you will encounter in existing collections and need to be able to work with, but you would not choose them for new storage today. Magnetic tape is the clear choice for large-scale mass storage, where cost per gigabyte is the dominant concern and fast access is not required. Hard disk drives are the everyday working standard: high capacity, reasonable cost, fast access, but mechanically fragile and requiring active maintenance. Flash memory is the best option for portability, durability under adverse conditions, and situations where you cannot maintain controlled storage environments, though it is expensive and requires refreshing. None of these media is set and forget. Tape requires format migration as standards evolve. Hard drives require refreshing and monitoring. Flash memory requires periodic data integrity checks. Even optical media in controlled conditions will eventually reach the end of its estimated useful life. This is why the 3-2-1 rule exists and why it matters. 3 copies of the data, stored on 2 different media types, with 1 copy off-site. The principle is not based on any single medium being reliable enough. It is based on the reality that every medium will eventually fail, and the goal is to ensure that no single failure is catastrophic.